pleased to welcome you to this talk by Dr. Susannah Heschel on Christian-Jewish relations in the context of the Third Reich. My name is Daniel Jocelyn Smitowski. I'm the director of the Center for Christian-Jewish Learning. This center is one of the sponsors for this event, along with the Jewish Studies program and the Film Studies program. This special lecture is part of Professor John Mahalzik's course on propaganda and the Third Reich. Unfortunately, John cannot join us today. So this lecture is also a part of what the Center for Christian-Jewish Learning has developed as the Jewish Christian Lecture Series, where professors teaching courses with explicit connections to Jewish-Christian relations receive support in bringing in guest lecturers. And so it's a pleasure to have an esteemed lecturer with us today in Susannah Heschel, who I would like to now introduce. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on the history of Jewish and Protestant religious thought in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries. She is the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible in Nazi Germany, as well as several edited volumes, including Betrayal, German Churches and the Holocaust. The recipient of 5 honorary doctorates from universities in the United States, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. She has held fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and held year-long fellowships at the National Humanities Center and the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. In 2013, she became a Guggenheim Fellow. Professor Heschel is a longtime friend of Boston College, and we're pleased to have her here with us today. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, and it is great to be here. I live just a mile down the road on Commonwealth Avenue, and I love being able to come here to be with my friends on the faculty and to have this chance to talk to you today. The title that I was given and asked to speak about has to do with Christian-Jewish relations during the Third Reich. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Is it all right? Okay, good. And so there are many ways that one could approach this issue. I could talk about some of the Christian theologians, Protestant Catholics, some of their attitudes or relationships with Jews. I can talk about Jews in Nazi Germany and some of the things they said about Christianity. But instead, I decided I would talk to you today about something that kind of doesn't quite fit either category entirely, namely, what about Jews who converted to Christianity and how were they treated by the churches during the Third Reich? And this, I think, brings to light some of the important issues that confronted Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, during the years of the Nazi Reich, but that also raises important questions to think about what happened once the war was over. So I want to tell you a bit about this from some research I did. Some of this is drawn from memoirs. We have a few, not enough. I wish we had more. And some from church archival records of what was going on within a given parish, and some is historical overview. But I'll begin with a wonderful memoir that was just recently published and edited by our colleague Kevin Spicer at Stonehill College, just down the road. It's a memoir of Erna Becker-Cohen. She was a German Jew who was baptized Roman Catholic in 1936. She was deeply pious and said she found great sustenance in prayer in church. In addition to singing in the church choir, she attended Mass regularly. All that changed in September 1941 when Jews living in the Nazi Reich had to wear a yellow star on their clothing. She wore the star and went into church. And this is where things really become quite revelatory for us as historians looking back. And here's what she writes, quote, "For a while, I was a member of the church choir in our little parish. Singing has always given me much joy, but now I had to give it up because a few singers did not like the idea of a Jew participating. I always remained modestly, even shyly, in the background. Still, I was not wanted. Now, you understand this. This is a woman who's been going to church for years and singing in the choir, but when she showed up with the yellow star, everything changed. That's the pivot. Now, why did she convert? It was not about protection from the Nazi regime that motivated her to convert in 1936, nor was it really her marriage to a Catholic engineer, but rather she had a genuine religious feeling. She says she saw light and yearned to be one of them, of the Christians. To see a light and yearn. Prayer, as I believe would all say, also with me, I feel, prayer is a hope for transformation. She sought, Erna, closeness to God, and she experienced an inner conversion and then was baptized Catholic. In March of 1938, her son, Sylvan, was born, and he too was baptized. What happened? In the autumn and September of 1941 in Nazi Germany, essentially Christians became Jews. Not through any kind of formal conversion process nor out of a faith decision, Jews who had converted to Christianity, who were baptized, were classified as Jewish by the Nazi race laws, and they were all required, even if they'd been baptized, to wear this yellow Star of David on their clothing wherever they went, including in church. What is this? This is race versus faith. The Nazi regime mandated that race transcends all other signifiers of identity, including baptism, which is, as we know, is a sacrament of the church that provides an indelible spiritual mark of belonging to Christ, in the words of Catholic Catechism. Prior to September 1941, those attending church services would likely not have known which parishioners were Jews, or who had been baptized by their parents at birth, or who had been baptized as adults. No one knew. But the yellow Star of David identified these Christians in public as racial Jews. So how did parishioners, congregants, pastors, priests, bishops, how did they react to this yellow star? And what does it tell us about Jews and Christians in Nazi Germany, but also about the role of Jews in the Christian imagination? What are the ambivalences toward baptized Jews tell us about Christian views, also of Jesus and his Jewishness? And then the larger question that we all face: how should religions respond to racism? So baptism, to Christianity, baptism did not allow Jews to escape the Nuremberg race laws, nor guarantee protection from deportation and death, but sometimes it could help. Some degree of protection was available to Jews who were, for example, married to Aryans or to converted Jews, so a Jew married to a Jew who was baptized. But these regulations were complicated, and they were never all that clear and never necessarily always enforced by the Nazis. What kinds of numbers are we talking about? I like to ask my students, what percentage of Germans do you think were Jewish? And they think, well, it must be 20%, 15%, because they kept worrying about their so-called Jewish problem. And it's actually less than 1% of the German population. 60 million, fewer than 500,000 Jews, half of whom emigrated before the war started. By 1939, there were 20,454 Jews in Germany married to Aryans. How many of those who had been baptized and who were classified by the Nazis as Jews, how many of them were arrested, deported, murdered? We don't have the numbers. As Becker Cohen writes in her memoir, the reception she received was mixed. And I want to just mention to you that many years ago, when I was a student at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I studied with a wonderful professor, David Bankier, who happened to mention in class something about this. He did a study of the Gestapo reports about the local population, how people were thinking and reacting to Nazi propaganda and so forth. And Professor Bankier mentioned once in class, in passing, that There were people who came with a yellow star and knelt at the communion rail, and then others in the church got upset and didn't want a Jew next to them at the communion rail. And that always stayed with me, because what does that signify to us? It tells us they didn't want a Jew kneeling next to them. Well, it was baptized, and if you're baptized, you're a Christian, so why would they object? Were they frightened of the Nazis, let's say? But they seemed to find a kind of visceral disgust. They didn't like it that this person would be next to them. And that always stayed with me all these years, and that's one of the reasons I decided I wanted to look into this. You know, initially after Hitler came to power, some Jews thought baptism might offer protection. Actually, 900 Jews converted to Christianity in the year 1933, the year Hitler came to power. But there were controversies among Protestants and Catholics about whether support and help should be given to Jews as the Nazi laws increased from month to month, year to year, squeezing the Jews out of the social context of Germany. I'll say more about that in a moment. But something more about the numbers. These so-called non-Aryan Christians in the Nazi Reich, number isn't 100%, but some historians estimate 300,000 by June of 1933, about 50,000 Christians in Germany who had 4 Jewish grandparents, 210,000 Germans with 2 Jewish grandparents, 80,000 with 1 Jewish grandparent. All these numbers, too many numbers, but the idea is simply that conversion to Christianity was not unknown for several generations within Germany. We know that in 1927, 25.8% of Jewish men and 16.1% of Jewish women had married non-Jews, Christians. In total, 44% of German Jews, it seems, were at some point or another marrying non-Jews. 200 to 400 were converting to Protestantism every year between 1900 and 1939, except in that one year, 1933, when there was a big influx. By October 1941, when emigration from Germany was actually no longer possible, only about 164,000 Jews were left in Germany, half of them living in Berlin. By April 1st, 1943, 31,900 Jews were left who wore Yellow Star of David. 17,375 Jews were in privileged marriages. I know these numbers are just floating, but the point is Jews were in different statuses. Not all Jews were in danger. Some had some protection through marriage to a non-Jew, to an Aryan. Some had protection if they lived, for example, in the city of Berlin, where there were hiding places. And some, as I'll show you, also had protection in quirky ways. I'll come to that. But one thing that I want to stress is the work of Wolf Gruner, professor at USC, University of Southern California, who has demonstrated that a lot of these regulations concerning Jews didn't come from above, but came from below. What he means by that is, even before the Nazi authorities issued a law banning Jews from, let's say, from schools or from civil service and so on, there were people in local communities, municipalities, villages, and cities, all three, he found, who would go to their local government, to the mayor, to the town council, and say, we don't want the Jews using our swimming pool, for example, our public spaces. And the municipal government would pass a law saying no Jews allowed. The point is that these regulations were coming from below at times, not necessarily from above. And that also means we have to think about the kinds of visceral reactions, emotional reactions to Jews that we encounter in some of these memoirs. What about the mood, the atmosphere? People can say something negative about Jews. Certainly, Kanye West, who you may have heard of. But we have to measure sometimes the emotional nature of the statement, too, the passion of it. And I'll give you an example. In February of 1943, there was a meeting of a group of Protestant pastors who supported Hitler, a meeting in a Berlin auditorium that was adorned with swastikas. And one of the pastors at this meeting is recorded making the following passionate statement. He said, "They say that everyone is equal before God, but baptism never made a Jew into a German, nor did it ever straighten a crooked hook nose." This echoes Nazi rhetoric. Just as a pig remains a pig, even if you put it in a horse's stall, so a Jew still remains a Jew, even if he is baptized. A newspaper from the time commenting on the baptism of a local Jewish family declared, quote, "From a dog, you are never going to fry bacon." The vulgarity of these statements is striking and should give us a sense of the nature of this discussion. You see what I mean? Now, in the terms of the involvement of churches in the Nazi project and the race laws, maybe the most important element is that to prove that you were an Aryan, you had to show your baptismal certificates for yourself, your parents, your grandparents. And it became actually a busy task of the churches to copy by hand baptismal certificates for all of these millions of people. Some churches, however, didn't simply supply the requested baptismal certificate. And by the way, if you think about it, what if they had refused to provide baptismal certificates? It would have been a problem for the Nazi regime. Okay. But some churches initiated their own investigations of the racial identity of their staff, their pastors, organists, teachers, and their congregants. One regional church in Oyton, for example, investigated its own records for baptismal certificates of their own congregants to determine who might be racial Jews. So again, from below, not necessarily from above. After the promulgation of the Nuremberg Laws in September 1935, baptism of Jews was forbidden by some Protestants, and pastors who continued to baptize Jews, whether babies or adults, did so at some risk. As an example, a young man, Horst Gessner, born in 1928 to a Jewish mother and a Christian father, by the way, who had converted to Judaism. Horst was baptized at age 10 in 1938 for protection, an act he describes as an act of resistance on the part of the pastor in the distinguished Sophienkirche in Berlin. And he reports that as a young man, he could walk in public without a yellow star, and when he was stopped, he would show his baptismal certificate instead of an identity card, and that allowed him some safety. But this conflict over baptism and race led to hefty debates among Protestants and ultimately to a split within the church, the Protestant church, between two factions. There were those who supported Hitler and those who wanted to change Christianity and bring it in accord with National Socialism. They called themselves the German Christian Movement. And then there were those called the Confessing Church who opposed, not Hitler necessarily, but who opposed altering the Bible and Christian doctrine to bring it in accord with the Nazi race laws. And one of the questions was whether the Aryan paragraph that fired Jews from the German civil service should be applied to the church. The Nazis were not in charge of the church, but church leaders themselves said, should we voluntarily take these laws on ourselves and fire any pastor who is racially Jewish? Some did, some didn't. But in considering the issue, the Protestant Theological Faculty of the Conservative University of Erlangen published a resolution written by two distinguished scholars, theologians, Paul Althaus and Werner Ehlert, by restricting, that is, they called for restricting the ordination of baptized Jews. The Protestant theologians at the University of Marburg, by contrast, issued a declaration that a racial Jew, quote unquote, who had accepted Christianity was a full-fledged member of the Christian church and should not suffer any discrimination. But even those who sided with the opinion of Marburg could be ambivalent. For example, in Berlin, there was a famous pastor, Martin Niemöller. I'm sure you must know the name, and you may see the famous quotation, first they came for the communists, I wasn't a communist, I didn't pretend, et cetera, et cetera. So Martin Niemöller was a famous figure in the confessing church, wrote in November 1933 that Christians found converted Jews disagreeable, despite the demands of Scripture, and that pastors of Jewish descent should work in parishes where they would not offend the congregation. In 1935, the synod, the Steglitz Synod of the Confessing Church, took a stronger stance, declaring that it is a sin to forbid the baptism of Jews, and it condemned those who reject baptism of Jews as a betrayal of Christ. At the same time, it was faced with the problem. Baptized Jews are one thing, and the Confessing Church did what it could to help baptized Jews who could often stand under threat. But what about Jews who hadn't been baptized? Should Jews who had not been baptized also receive support from the church? The theologian Karl Barth spoke out strongly already in 1933, warning that belonging to the church is determined not by blood and race, but by the Holy Spirit and by baptism. Quote, if the German Protestant church would exclude the Jewish Christians or treat them as second-class Christians, it would have ceased to be a Christian church. Now, it was Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, who instigated the mandate that all Jews over age 6 and over living in the Nazi Reich had to wear the yellow badge on their clothing starting on the 15th of September 1941. This was published in the official Nazi Reich Gazette, and the ruling was applied also, of course, to baptized Jews, whether or not they were registered in the church as Protestant or Catholic. Jews, however, who were married to Aryans and were raising their children as Christian were not required to wear a star. But Jews who were married to Aryans and had no child had to wear this star. Just to give you a sense of how complicated this was, one memoir, a memoirist, Louisa Zolmitz, writes of her family's relief that her husband, Ferdi, would not have to wear a star. He was privileged because he was married to her, an Aryan woman, and had a child. The family was worried. The regulations for wearing a yellow star were complicated. The star had to be sewn properly. Wearing it improperly risked arrest. For Jews, wearing a yellow star in public brought anguish, and this is described by the great Victor Klemperer in his diary. Quote, and he was a Jewish professor married to an Aryan woman. Quote, yesterday as Eva was sewing on the Jew's star, they had no children, he was a Jew, I had a raving fit of despair. He reports in his diary that a neighbor went out wearing the star, but walking with her umbrella up, even though it had stopped raining, because then her arm would cover the star. Or walking with a package or a bag pressed against it. But a circular from the Jewish community, he writes, has warned against it. It is severely punished. In a way, being forced to display the star, the historian Edward Timms writes, was a kind of death threat. It felt that way. Half Jews were Jews, quarter Jews had some leeway. In 1942, forced labor camps were established for those determined by the Nazis to be Mischlinge, having both Jewish and Aryan ancestry. And some of their Aryan spouses were sent to those labor camps as well. But keeping in mind also the larger context, starting with the greater isolation of Jews in 1938, Jews were isolated, alone. And that made the 1941 appearance of Jews on the streets marked with the yellow Star of David all the more startling. Jews who had been forced by Nazi regulations to disappear from public life were now suddenly conspicuous, appearing in the streets, marked yellow and looking wan. Most Jews who remained in Germany by 1941 were elderly, poor, socially isolated, and struggling for food. Jews were only allowed to shop for 1 hour a day from 4 to 5 p.m., forbidden entry to public events or theaters or parks, expelled from schools and universities, civil service jobs, and no one was allowed to converse with Jews in public. Churches and trams may have been the only enclosed spaces where these Aryans and Jews mingled. Riding the trams, Jews encountered a mixed response. Inge Deutschkron reports in her memoir that one day, riding the tram in Berlin, a man offered her his seat. "Please sit down," he said to me in a loud voice, pointing to his vacant seat. Most of the other passengers pretended not to have heard. It was the morning rush hour, and I was not the only one standing. I was convinced that if it were not for my Jewish star, the man would not have offered me his seat. It was a gesture. And yet, in Stuttgart, Anna Hoag reports in her diary entry of 7th of October 1941, a newspaper denounced the sympathy shown to Jews riding the trams in town. The newspaper claimed to have received numerous letters from readers, angry at the sympathy shown to Jews. One reader was appalled by seeing someone shaking hands with a Jewish woman in public and wrote to the newspaper, "Here I think there is only one solution. Put her up against the wall." And notice that this was the month, October 1941, when Germans began to hear reports about Jews being murdered in Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine. What do we make of all of this? The goal of racism is to produce a state of revulsion that shatters regulatory practices, whether of law, social etiquette, religious doctrine, or economic status. How can someone complain? How can someone complain about a person kneeling next to them at the communion rail? You don't do that. But these etiquettes are shattered. Nazi anti-Semitism, such as associating Jews with rats in the propaganda film Ewige Jude, went beyond hate and fear to arouse, deliberately, horror and disgust, and a desire to exterminate Jews as one would exterminate vermin. For Christians in Nazi Germany, as the conflict between race and religion intensified from 1933 to 1941, anti-Semitic propaganda was trumpeted not only by the regime, but also in some church publications and sermons. And actions were taken by some of the Protestant regional churches to remove Jewish or Hebrew words and concepts from the hymnal, even from the Bible. But what did baptism of Jews mean to Christians in the midst of Nazi racial politics? One Protestant pastor in Berlin was told by a congregant that he should not place his hand on her child's head if that hand had baptized a Jew. She apparently felt his hand was contaminated. Baptism could not overcome Nazi racism toward Jews as repugnant, one of the primitive emotions. Primitive emotion, disgust. And it can't be placated by church doctrine. Now, in September 41, just hearing about some of the hostile reactions to Christians wearing yellow stars in Catholic churches, the Roman Catholic Cardinal Adolf Bertram, the Archbishop of Breslau, issued a series of regulations. He urged pastors to avoid a separate seating section for baptized Jews and instead advised baptized Jews to attend an early morning mass because that would be sparsely attended. Fewer Aryan Christians would be offended by the presence of baptized Jews. Only, he said, Bertram said, only if parishioners stopped attending Mass or walked out in protest of the presence of Christians with a yellow star, only then could a segregated service just for baptized Jews take place. And he wrote, quote, reminders concerning brotherly love and avoiding every form of denigrating treatment of any Catholic non-Aryan marked by the star are to be issued to members of the congregation attending Mass only when and if disturbances arise. And he concluded by citing Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is neither, oh, everybody knows the verse, Galatians 3:28, yes? In Christ there is neither Greek nor Jew, right? So, by the way, you know, it's that verse, which to our ears may sound quite liberal, neither Greek nor Jew, neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. Actually, that verse was used by the supporters of the Nazis within the Protestant church to justify excluding Jews because they argued that what the verse says, they said like this, when you go to a church, don't you see men and women? Baptism does not get rid of your gender. And so baptism doesn't get rid of your race either. So a Jew remains a Jew. It's just an interesting twist on that verse. So that was Cardinal Bertram. By contrast, many Protestant church officials wanted baptized Jews excluded. Already in 1933, in the inaugural speech of the Protestant Bishop of Saxony, Friedrich Koch, urged the Reich church minister in the government, the Nazi government, Hans Karel, to establish separate churches for baptized Jews. And he demanded that pastors prove not only their own Aryan ancestry, but also that of their wives. A few months later, in his eulogy for the notorious anti-Semite Theodor Fritsch, this Bishop Koch praised Fritsch for understanding that the, quote, real significance of world history was conflict between Christianity and Jews. According to Erna Becker-Cohen's diary, not all fellow Catholics expressed the generosity that Bertram advised. She reports that in April 1942, quote, a Jewish convert who has to wear the Jewish star was asked to think of the other parishioners. And if he had to attend Mass, at the very least, take a seat in the choir loft. And she continues, because he is such a deeply pious man, he now takes a seat in the choir loft where no one can see him. Ostracized and isolated, Becker-Cohen was not invited to the homes of her fellow parishioners, not even at Christmas, though at times she was assisted by sympathetic priests as she traveled throughout the Reich, seeking refuge from imprisonment. Even in Berlin, she writes in April 1942, quote, I hardly can venture outside in my neighborhood anymore because people will not leave me in peace. For the same reason, I can also no longer go to the local church in our suburb. I therefore travel every morning to St. Hedwig Cathedral, where Father Irwin celebrates Mass daily at 10 a.m., end quote. But here's another report. As you know, and I have to just mention, I just spent a week in Poland, and I just returned today at 2 a.m. The flight from JFK was 2 hours late. But there were a lot of Jewish children hidden. I met a woman who was from the town of Opt, in Polish called Opato. And at the age of 1.5, her mother was murdered. Her father put her with a convent, and he was imprisoned and survived 2 Nazi concentration camps and came back to get her. And she was by then 4, didn't recognize him. And it was a big struggle for him to obtain her, to take her back from the convent again. Another, though, I just want to read you, Nechama Tek, who was born in 1931 and hidden by Catholics for 3 years in Poland, later wrote, quote, and she, of course, was much older, Nechama Tek, who was also a great scholar. I had come to look forward eagerly to being in a church because the quiet and peace were soothing. In the stillness, I could whisper my secrets without fear. The woman that I met in Opt just on Sunday said that when she finally went to her father, she was 5.5, and she prayed Christian prayers, but also said very negative things about Jews, because that's how she had been, what she had heard, what she had taken in. So some Protestant churches instituted separate seating for baptized Jews. For example, at the beginning of the service, Jewish Christians in the Dahlem fancy neighborhood in Berlin scurried to take a seat on the special benches in the half-dark in order to participate in the service, Protestant service. Some pastors suggested placing a sign on church doors, "No admittance for Jews," or "Admittance for wearers of the Jewish star prohibited." Protestant officialdom in Berlin was ambivalent at best, the historian Wolfgang Gerlach writes, refusing either to permit or forbid such signage. No known discussion took place among church authorities about making a church, for example, a yellow star-free zone, a place where, like a private home, the badge would not have to be worn. No, one had to wear it in church. But help for baptized Jews also came. I want to try to present to you different facets, but realizing, and I want to emphasize this, that no single facet is representative of the entire story. These are individual experiences. We don't have the kinds of numbers that a social historian would like to have, percentages, and so forth. We don't have that. And it's also important to keep in mind that those who tried to help Jews and Jews who had been baptized got into very serious trouble, let's say. I'll give you one example. You may know about Pastor Heinrich Gruber, who ran a relief center for Protestant non-Aryans, so Jews who had been baptized, and who were in danger of deportation. Working with him was a woman named Katharina Staritz, who was a Protestant vicar in Breslau and a member of the Confessing Church. And in the fall of 1941, she issued a protest against this regulation that Jews wear a yellow star. She said, baptized Jews had nothing to do with Judaism. They were loyal members of the Christian church. It's problematic. But she warned against unchristian behavior. As a consequence, the SS newspaper of March 1942 attacked her, and that led to her arrest and a year in Ravensbrück. When she returned from Ravensbrück, she was relieved of her position. Now, Katharina Staritz risked her life. And then there was Berlin pastor Karl Tamel, Starting very early in 1934, Karl Tamel searched for non-Aryan Christians within the Berlin Church. He went through 255,469 Aryan certificates and identified 2,612 Christians of Jewish heritage whom he denounced to the Gestapo. Their dates of deportation, death, unknown. And this leads to the question of the pastors themselves. Can I still talk another 10 minutes or so? Is that okay? Is everybody okay? Yeah? Okay. I just have to tell you I feel like some of the people, the actual human beings here. There were pastors and priests, Protestant and Catholic, who were arrested, imprisoned, and murdered on the grounds that they were Jews, baptized but Jews. Bruno Benfey of Göttingen, Paul Leo of Osnabrück, Gustav Ohlert of Rinteln, non-Aryan, arrested. Pastor Werner Zulten, a converted Jew, was arrested for his work with Pastor Gruber, assisting the persecuted. He was sent to Dachau and killed there. The same with so many others. In Dachau, there was a special unit within the concentration camp for the Catholic priests who were sent there. What many of them reported, though, those who were not killed but who survived, was that nothing was done on their behalf by church hierarchy, Protestant or Catholic. What could they have done is not clear, but one case of an non-Aryan Catholic priest, the son of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, was baptized as a child. After being ordained in 1936, he was sent to work in a remote village in order to keep the fact that he was half Jewish secret. In 1940, he volunteered as a chaplain for the Wehrmacht and observed Jews being deported. But then he was expelled by the Wehrmacht because he wasn't an Aryan and put in a concentration camp. Again, nothing was done for him. His father was murdered at Auschwitz. A brother survived in hiding. But no one talked about it, he said, after the war, and nothing was done during the war. Something similar from Protestant pastor Heinz Wolf, who had a Jewish father, also volunteered as a chaplain in the Wehrmacht. He was imprisoned when they discovered he was not an Aryan. All right. I want to turn now, in my conclusion, to some observations of interpretation. So a baptized Jew in Nazi Europe lived in a state of limbo, wanting safety, some protection, of course, kindness, compassion. And this is the question: who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? Kenneth Reinhard writes that the, quote, the political is the condition of the ethical, the only ground by which we approach ethics and not vice versa, end quote. Within the Nazi realm, Jews were desperate to save their lives. For Christians, who also faced threats of imprisonment, though not genocide, the political had reconfigured the ethical. The churches worked on both sides of the equation, copying and distributing millions of baptismal certificates that made possible identifying who was Aryan and who wasn't. Offering baptism or marrying Jews to save them from Nazi murder varied throughout Europe. Baptism in Bosnia under Croatian control offered genuine security to Jews, whereas in Romania, baptism offered no protection from the state or from church authorities. In Slovakia, some priests refused baptism to Jews because their motivation was not piety, but they said pragmatism, saving your life. The great Catholic theologian Edith Stein was born a Jew and converted to Catholicism in 1922. She entered as a novice in a Discalced Carmelite convent in Germany in 1933 and was moved for her own safety to a convent in the Netherlands and was taken by the Nazis in 1942 and murdered in Auschwitz. I imagine everyone here knows her story. But these strong emotions evoked in Christians by the presence of Jews marked with the yellow Star of David reflects, on the one hand, anxieties of living under Nazi rule, but also the underlying anxiety within Christianity regarding its own roots within Judaism. Despite the wish of the church for the conversion of the Jews, the mass baptism of Jews in 15th century Spain gave rise to a conflict or a crisis of classification. This unheimlich, this uncanny, unheimlich Jew was now inside the Heim, the church, the home. The satisfaction of the Christian wish that the Jews should convert nonetheless aroused suspicion, anxiety, and disgust. The Inquisition was called to Spain to investigate these new Christians to determine their sincerity and whether they were Judaizing other Christians, infecting them with their Jewishness. The Catholic Church then developed its insistence on the purity of blood, and Spain decided to expel its Jews in 1492. As Jacques Lacan writes, there is a gap between the articulation of a wish and what occurs when its desire sets out on the path of its realization. As Christians entered German churches wearing a yellow star, a feeling arose of the uncanny. Were these Christians, or were they Jews in the wrong place, threatening the church's pure Aryan Christianness? I just want to turn to the great essay by Freud called The Uncanny that I imagine everybody here is familiar with, where Freud links the experience of the uncanny to intrusion. That which he felt as uncanny appeared to him at first as an intruder had come in, but then he recognized the intruder as a mirror image of himself. And I think that tells us something about Christianity and Judaism. So here's what Freud writes. He's in a train. That's the setting. I was sitting alone in my compartment when a more than usually violent jolt of the train swung back the door of the adjoining washing cabinet, and an elderly gentleman in a dressing gown and traveling cap came in. I assumed that in leaving the washing cabinet, that means the bathroom, by assuming leaving the washing cabinet, which lay between the two compartments, he had taken the wrong direction and come into my compartment by mistake. Jumping up with the intention of putting him right, I had once realized to my dismay that the intruder was nothing but my own reflection in the looking glass in the open door. The putative intruder was Freud himself, or rather a reflection of Freud in the mirror, his mirror image. A baptized Jew, that is, a Christian, appears in church wearing a yellow Star of David, a marker of Jewishness. Has the Jew become an intruder into Christian space? Or has a Christian entered beneath that yellow star as a replica of the Christian self? Christianity as baptized Judaism. Now misplaced, Christianity suddenly looking at the yellow star and experiencing itself as an intruder, an unheimlich. Growing German nationalism in the 19th century viewed Jews with suspicion as intruders, and Jewish assimilation only furthered the growing suspicion that Jews were invisible, unmarked, and unrecognizable. The outsider became insider, in Peter Gay's famous phrase about the Weimar period, the Jew intruding into the heart of German culture. But Jews as intruders into German culture shifted with the rise of racism, which transformed anti-Jewish hostility into a visceral experience. Germany became a body, and the Jew was not simply an intruder, but even viewed as vermin, or as a medical infection, or a sexual penetration, even a rape of German culture. A baptized Jew is not merely sitting in the wrong pew and asked to move to the choir loft. A baptized Jew now evoked disgust, so that a pastor who baptized a Jew was asked not to place his hand on the head of a Christian child. Sacraments became sites of anxiety. How could a Jewish body become part of a parish or congregation and take communion? How could the body of Christ be taken into the body of a Jew, even a baptized Jew? A baptized Jew came to be feared as a transplant from the body of a beast, not as a lack, but as an excess, Jewishness transplanted onto the healthy body of Christianness. The problem that faced the churches with this yellow star crisis recapitulates the larger problem of Christianity emerging out of Judaism. Jesus, the Jew, becoming the first and greatest Christian, the New Testament, writing proleptically from the Old Testament, Paul declaring the Gentiles are grafted onto the olive tree of Judaism, Christians as the new Israel of the Spirit, baptized Jews coming to church aroused the anxieties. Is Christianity itself a baptized Judaism? Wearing a yellow star, converted Jews were not simply intruders, but threatened a deeper Christian fear, that of Romans 11, that Gentiles have been grafted onto Judaism. If the church is a body, Jewishness poses a threat. If Christianity was born out of Judaism or birthed by the Jew, Jesus, it has already been infiltrated by the Jewish presence, and that is the anxiety felt in 1941. Baptized Jews entering the church with a yellow star constituted more than a Jewish intrusion into Christian sanctified space. They served as a symbolic reminder that Judaism is already part of the Christian body, that the Aryan Christian cannot be protected from contamination with Jewish blood. Just one last word about what happened after the war to these baptized Jews. After the war, the remaining 50 to 60,000 Jews in Germany who had converted to Christianity were trapped between communities. Most had Jewish relatives who had been murdered, but because of their conversion, they did not receive assistance from Jewish aid organizations. Christian organizations and churches did not understand the complexity of their needs, nor did they take responsibility for the catastrophe. Nazi hatred of Jews had been cultivated for the past 12 years, and it couldn't be overcome quickly. It lingered. They were Jews and they were Christians, and in certain ways they were treated like refugees seeking entry into a national border, neither Jews nor Christians. In the year 2002, Bishop Wolfgang Huber, the Protestant Bishop of Berlin, suggested that memorials be placed in churches for those baptized Jews who had been murdered. At Berlin's Messiaskapelle in the Prenzlauer Berg neighborhood, a very nice neighborhood in the Mitte, east part of East Germany, in that church, congregants have gathered the names and the fate of more than 700 Jews of that parish who were baptized between 1933 and 1940. Of those, 86 were murdered by the Nazis. But how should those people be commemorated, and who should commemorate them? Now, I want to say finally, why am I talking about this? I ask myself sometimes, because it's not a pleasant topic to talk about Nazi Germany. And it leaves us feeling bitterness in the mouth, no? To hear about this, it's horrible. This is not really what I would like to see if we come together to talk about Judaism and Christianity, if we have Jewish-Christian dialogue as we have at the center here at Boston College. This is a piece of history that's important for us to know. But Christian-Jewish dialogue is something very different. And I want to just say that we should always remember that, even when we've heard a talk about this topic. I think we should keep in mind that the dialogue that we carry out isn't just carried out between us as Jews and Christians, as people. I think we should keep in mind, and I say this after a very heavy week in Poland, that God is present and listening, when we have our dialogues. Moses says in Deuteronomy 32, "Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak. Let the earth listen to the words of my mouth." In commenting on this, the rabbis explain that at that moment, Moses stood in heaven and he spoke to both heaven and earth. I think that's a good way for us to think about what Jewish-Christian dialogue should be. That heaven is watching and listening to us. And my hope is that as we develop this Jewish-Christian dialogue that we're engaging in and watch it flourish, that our dialogue itself can be a form of prayer. Thank you.